When billionaire tech magnate Nathaniel Pierce slid the divorce papers across the polished mahogany table, he thought he was simply trimming the dead weight from his perfect $8 billion life. He offered his quiet, unassuming wife $10 million, a severance package for a decade of mediocrity. He expected tears, begging, perhaps a pathetic plea for a second chance. Instead, Audrey picked up the Mont Blanc pen, signed her name with a terrifyingly steady hand, and walked away without a dime. Nathaniel smiled, convinced he had just won his freedom. He had absolutely no idea he had just severed his only tie to the Sinclair Syndicate, a shadow empire worth over $4 trillion, and that by the time the ink dried, his own destruction had already begun. The grand ballroom of the St. Regis in San Francisco was bathed in a wash of gold and azure light, the corporate colors of Pierce Dynamics. It was the company's 10th anniversary, a night designed to celebrate the meteoric rise of Nathaniel Pierce, the Silicon Valley wunderkind who had built an artificial intelligence logistics empire from a dusty garage into a Wall Street juggernaut. At the center of the room, surrounded by a sycophantic orbit of venture capitalists, senators, and Hollywood A-listers, stood Nathaniel. He was 41, impeccably tailored in a bespoke Tom Ford tuxedo, his jawline sharp, his smile practiced and predatory. He radiated the kind of arrogant magnetism that only comes with a net worth of $8 billion. Standing entirely outside that orbit, nursing a glass of sparkling water near the grand floral displays, was his wife, Audrey. Audrey Pierce was 38, dressed in a simple, unbranded charcoal silk gown that lacked the blinding sequins and plunging necklines favored by the wives and mistresses of the tech elite. To the untrained eye, she looked ordinary, perhaps even a little out of place. The kind of woman who had married the CEO before he was rich and had simply failed to evolve alongside his bank account. That was certainly what the tabloids implied. The anchor and the sail, one particularly cruel blog had called them, suggesting Audrey was the heavy, unremarkable anchor holding back Nathaniel's soaring ambitions. What the bloggers, the board of directors, and even Nathaniel himself did not know was that Audrey's unbranded silk gown had been hand-stitched by a reclusive Parisian couturier who only took commissions from European royalty. The simple, unadorned diamond stud earrings she wore were flawless, D-color stones mined from a private reserve. Audrey was not just Audrey Pierce. She was Audrey Sinclair, the only daughter of Alistair Sinclair. The Sinclair family did not appear on Forbes lists. They did not ring the bell at the New York Stock Exchange. They were old, deep, invisible money. The Sinclair Consortium controlled shipping lanes in the Pacific, vast swathes of prime real estate in London and Tokyo, and the rare earth mineral mines that powered the very microchips Pierce Dynamics relied upon. Their estimated family wealth hovered somewhere north of $2 trillion. 10 years ago, Audrey had hidden her identity when she met Nathaniel at a low-key coffee shop in Palo Alto. Her father had warned her entire life that men would only ever see the Sinclair vault, never the woman standing in front of it. Nathaniel, intense and hungry for success, hadn't cared about her background. He had loved her quiet intelligence and steady support. He didn't know that the anonymous $500,000 angel investment that kept his startup from going bankrupt in its second year came directly from Audrey's private trust fund. But a decade of wealth had poisoned Nathaniel. The hungry innovator had been replaced by a ruthless, image-obsessed titan. "She looks like a substitute teacher who wandered into the wrong party," a voice purred. Audrey didn't have to turn around to know it was Valerie Kensington. Valerie was Pierce Dynamics' 30-year-old chief financial officer. She was a striking, statuesque blonde, draped in crimson Oscar de la Renta, wearing a diamond tennis necklace that Audrey instantly recognized, because Nathaniel's assistant had accidentally sent the receipt for it to the house 2 months ago. It cost $500,000. Valerie walked past Audrey, brushing her shoulder deliberately, making a beeline for Nathaniel. When she reached him, she placed a proprietary hand on his forearm. Nathaniel turned, his eyes lighting up in a way they hadn't for Audrey in years. He leaned in, whispering something that made Valerie throw her head back in a perfectly calculated laugh. Audrey watched the exchange with a chilling calmness. For months, she had tolerated Nathaniel's late nights, the sudden, emergency board meetings in Paris, the scent of expensive Santal perfume lingering on his coats. She had stayed out of loyalty to the vows she made, hoping the man she loved was still somewhere beneath the billionaire facade. But watching them tonight, the truth settled over her like a heavy winter coat. The man she married was dead. He had been suffocated by his own ego. Later that evening, in the back seat of their chauffeured Maybach, heading back to their Atherton estate, the silence between husband and wife was deafening. Nathaniel stared at his phone, scrolling through market futures, while Audrey looked out the window at the passing streetlights. Valerie gave an excellent presentation on the Q3 earnings today, Nathaniel said suddenly, not looking up. She's dynamic, forward-thinking. The board loves her. I'm sure they do, Audrey replied, her tone perfectly level. Nathaniel finally looked at her, his expression hardening into one of profound annoyance. You could have made an effort tonight, Audrey. The governor was there. The CEO of Vanguard. You stood in the corner like a wallflower. It's embarrassing. I spoke with the governor for 20 minutes, Nathaniel. We discussed the new municipal broadband initiative. You were too busy doing shots of Class Azul with your CFO to notice. Nathaniel scoffed, loosening his bow tie with a harsh tug. Don't start this. I'm carrying a multi-billion-dollar company on my back. I need a partner who can stand in the spotlight with me, not someone who shrinks from it. Someone who understands the velocity of the life I've built. The life you built, Audrey thought, on the foundation I secretly poured. If you find me so ill-suited for the spotlight, Nathaniel, Audrey said softly, perhaps it's time I stepped off the stage completely. Nathaniel's eyes narrowed. He looked at her not as a wife, but as a depreciating asset. Maybe it is. We'll talk tomorrow. In my office. The next morning, the fog rolling off the San Francisco Bay mirrored the chill inside the executive suite of Pierce Dynamics. The office was a monument to Nathaniel's ego, floor-to-ceiling glass, offering a panoramic view of the city he felt he owned, minimalist Italian furniture, and walls adorned with framed patents and magazine covers featuring his own face. Audrey arrived at exactly 10 a.m. She wore a tailored beige trench coat over a simple white silk blouse and wide-leg trousers. She carried no designer handbag, only a sleek leather portfolio. When she entered, Nathaniel was sitting behind his massive marble desk. He wasn't alone. Sitting casually on the leather sofa to the side, sipping an espresso, was Valerie Kensington. Audrey paused for a fraction of a second, her gaze flicking from Nathaniel to Valerie, before she walked further into the room. I was under the impression this was a private discussion regarding our marriage, Nathaniel. Nathaniel didn't even have the grace to look guilty. He leaned back in his chair, adopting the cold, detached posture he used in negotiations. Valerie is here in her capacity as my financial advisor. What we are about to discuss has significant implications for the company's stock and my personal equity. I see, Audrey said, taking a seat opposite the desk. She kept her spine perfectly straight. So I am no longer a wife. I am a corporate liability. Valerie smirked over the rim of her espresso cup. Let's not be dramatic, Audrey. Nathaniel is simply looking out for the future of Pierce Dynamics. Audrey turned her head slowly, fixing Valerie with a look so chilling, so devoid of emotion, that the younger woman's smirk faltered. When I require the input of the hired help, Miss Kensington, I will ask for it. Until then, you will remain silent. Valerie flushed deep red, opening her mouth to snap back, but Nathaniel held up a hand. Enough, Nathaniel said sharply. He reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a thick, cream-colored manila envelope. He tossed it onto the marble surface. It slid to a halt inches from Audrey's hands. Let's cut to the chase, Audrey. You and I both know this hasn't been working for a long time. I'm moving at 100 miles a minute, and you're perfectly content sitting still. We want different things. And what is it you want, Nathaniel? She asked quietly. I want a divorce, he stated. The words hung in the sterile air of the office. Audrey looked at the envelope. For a brief, agonizing moment, the ghost of the boy she had loved 10 years ago flashed in her mind. The boy who had promised to build a life with her, who had laughed with her on the floor of a cramped studio apartment eating cheap takeout. That boy was gone. In his place was a stranger wearing a custom suit, eager to discard her for an upgrade. I see, Audrey said. Her voice didn't shake. And what are the terms? Nathaniel leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk, slipping into his comfort zone. The art of the deal. As you know, California is a community property state. However, the company was incorporated before we were officially married, and the restructuring 3 years ago severely diluted any claim you might try to make. If you try to fight me in court, I will tie you up in litigation for the next 20 years. I have the best legal team in the country. You'll be ruined by legal fees before we even reach a judge. So you are threatening me. I'm laying out the facts, Nathaniel countered smoothly. But I'm not a monster, Audrey. We had good times. I want you to be comfortable. So, my lawyers have drafted a very generous settlement. He tapped the envelope. If you sign the non-disclosure agreement and agree to an uncontested, no-fault divorce, I am prepared to offer you a lump sum of $10 million. I'll also transfer the deed of the Carmel-by-the-Sea beach house into your name, and you can keep whatever vehicles and jewelry you currently possess. You'll never have to work a day in your life. $10 million. It was roughly 0.12% of his total net worth. It was, in billionaire terms, an insulting tip left on a restaurant table. Valerie chimed in, unable to help herself. It's more than fair, Audrey. You've never contributed to the company's growth. $10 million is a massive windfall for someone who doesn't even have a career. Audrey slowly reached out and picked up the envelope. She didn't open it. She looked at Nathaniel, her eyes searching his face for any sign of hesitation, any shred of decency. There was none. He looked triumphant, as if he had just closed a successful acquisition. He truly believed he was the master of the universe. He truly believed he was untouchable. $10 million, Audrey repeated softly, testing the weight of the words. Tax-free, Nathaniel added, with a magnanimous nod. But the NDA is non-negotiable. You don't speak to the press. You don't write a book. You fade quietly into the background. Audrey felt a strange sensation washing over her. It wasn't grief. It wasn't heartbreak. It was liberation. For 10 years, she had suppressed her identity, her power, and her heritage, all to protect the fragile ego of the man sitting across from her. She had played the part of the meek, supportive wife perfectly. Now, the play was over. I will give you your divorce, Nathaniel, Audrey said, her voice echoing with an unnatural calm in the large room. Nathaniel exhaled, a visible wave of relief washing over him. Valerie smiled brightly. "However," Audrey continued, standing up smoothly, "I will not be taking your $10 million. I do not want your beach house, and I will certainly not be signing a non-disclosure agreement." Nathaniel's brow furrowed. "Audrey, don't be stupid. If you don't take the settlement, you walk away with absolutely nothing. You have no independent income." "I am perfectly capable of looking after myself," she said, picking up her leather portfolio. "Have your lawyers send the paperwork to my representative. We will finalize the dissolution of this marriage by Friday." "Who is your representative?" Nathaniel asked, suddenly suspicious of her calm demeanor. "If you hire some ambulance chaser to try and drag this out." "My representative will contact yours," Audrey interrupted smoothly. She turned toward the door, her heels clicking softly against the hardwood floor. Before she exited, she paused and looked back over her shoulder. "Enjoy the spotlight, Nathaniel. It can be incredibly blinding right before a fall." By Friday afternoon, the atmosphere in the glass-walled conference room of Croft and Associates, Nathaniel's high-powered legal firm, was decidedly tense. Benjamin Croft, a silver-haired shark of a lawyer who charged $2,000 an hour, sat beside Nathaniel. Across the massive oak table sat Audrey, perfectly composed in a charcoal-grey suit. Beside her sat a man Nathaniel had never seen before. He was older, perhaps in his late 60s, impeccably dressed in a bespoke Savile Row suit. He radiated a quiet, terrifying authority. He carried no briefcase, only a single slender leather folder. "This is Jonathan Graves," Audrey said simply, by way of introduction. Benjamin Croft narrowed his eyes, mentally scanning his encyclopedic knowledge of San Francisco and New York divorce attorneys. The name didn't ring a bell. "Mr. Graves, I don't believe I'm familiar with your firm." "I do not work for a firm, Mr. Croft," Graves replied. His voice had a refined, aristocratic British lilt. "I am private counsel." Nathaniel scoffed impatiently, checking his Rolex. He was supposed to be at a celebratory lunch with Valerie in an hour. "Let's get this over with. Audrey, I'm giving you one last chance to take the $10 million. Once we sign this, you are cut off. Completely." Audrey didn't look at him. She looked at Graves, giving a brief, microscopic nod. Graves opened his leather folder and withdrew a single sheet of paper. "My client waives all rights to spousal support, alimony, and any claim upon the assets of Pierce Dynamics or Mr. Pierce's personal estate. She accepts zero financial compensation from this divorce. In exchange, the non-disclosure agreement is struck from the record, and the divorce is sealed and finalized immediately today." Benjamin Croft looked stunned. In his 30 years of practice, he had never seen the spouse of a billionaire willingly walk away from hundreds of millions, let alone a guaranteed $10 million without a fight. He leaned over, whispering frantically in Nathaniel's ear. "She's giving it all up," Croft whispered. "It's ironclad. She gets nothing. Take the deal before she comes to her senses." Nathaniel looked at Audrey, a flicker of unease passing through him. Why was she doing this? Where was the catch? But his arrogance quickly crushed the doubt. She was just proud and stupid, he concluded. She wanted to play the martyr. Fine. Let her starve on her pride. "Slide the papers over," Nathaniel said, pulling his gold Mont Blanc pen from his breast pocket. Croft pushed the thick stack of divorce decrees across the table. Nathaniel didn't even read them. He quickly flipped to the back pages, his signature slashing aggressively across the dotted lines. Nathaniel Pierce. He pushed the papers toward Audrey. Audrey took the pen Graves handed her. For a moment, she held it suspended above the paper. She looked at Nathaniel one last time, He was already looking at his phone, entirely dismissed her existence. With a steady, fluid motion, she signed her name. Not Audrey Pierce. Audrey Sinclair. Graves carefully collected the documents, placing them back into his folder. "It is done. The marriage is legally dissolved. Good day, gentlemen." Audrey stood up, buttoning her jacket. She didn't say a word as she turned and walked out of the conference room, Graves following a step behind her like a shadow. Nathaniel let out a long breath, a triumphant grin spreading across his face. "Well, that was the easiest 10 million I've ever saved. Let's get a drink, Ben." But before Croft could reply, the heavy glass door of the conference room burst open. It was David, Nathaniel's chief operating officer. The man looked like he had just seen a ghost. His tie was askew, and he was clutching an iPad with white-knuckled intensity. "Nathaniel, we have a massive problem," David gasped, out of breath. Nathaniel's smile vanished. "What is it? Did the servers crash?" "No, it's the Aegis acquisition," David said, his voice trembling. Pierce Dynamics had been quietly staging a hostile takeover of Aegis Micrologistics, a European firm that held the patents to the next-generation microchips Nathaniel desperately needed to stay ahead of his competitors. The deal was supposed to close on Monday. "What about it?" Nathaniel snapped. "We have a controlling interest. The board vote is a formality." "Not anymore." David swallowed hard, turning the iPad around so Nathaniel could see the screen. 20 minutes ago, a private equity group initiated a massive buyout of Aegis's outstanding shares. They outbid us by 40%. They just secured 62% of the voting rights. The hostile takeover is dead, Nathaniel. We are locked out. Nathaniel felt the blood drain from his face. That's impossible. No one has that kind of liquid capital just lying around to deploy in 20 minutes. Who the hell bought it? David scrolled down the screen, his hands shaking. The SEC filing just hit. It's a holding company based in Luxembourg, but the parent organization is listed as the Sinclair Consortium. Benjamin Croft frowned. Sinclair, the shipping people? Nathaniel's mind raced. Sinclair. He had heard whispers of the name in the darkest, most exclusive corners of Davos and the World Economic Forum. The trillion-dollar ghost empire. But why would they care about a mid-level microchip manufacturer? And why strike exactly now? His eyes darted to the empty chair where Audrey had just been sitting. He remembered the name she had signed on the paper. Audrey Sinclair. Suddenly, Nathaniel's phone began to vibrate violently on the oak table. It was an alert from his stockbroker. Then another alert. And another. "Nathaniel," David whispered, staring at his own phone now. "Pierce Dynamics stock. It's in free fall. 3 of our largest suppliers in Asia just issued notices of immediate contract termination." "On what grounds?" Nathaniel yelled, panic finally piercing through his titanium ego. "No grounds," David said, looking up with terrified eyes. "They just paid the penalty fees in full and cut us off. And Nathaniel, all 3 suppliers are subsidiaries of the Sinclair Syndicate." Nathaniel stumbled back, the edge of the conference table digging into his lower back. The room seemed to spin. 10 minutes ago, he was the king of the world, shedding a useless wife to conquer the future. Now his supply chain was disintegrating, his multi-billion-dollar acquisition was dead, and his stock was bleeding out on the floor. He realized, with a sickening drop in his stomach, that Audrey hadn't walked away with nothing. She had simply walked away with the power to take everything else. The Bloomberg terminal in Nathaniel Pierce's office was bleeding. The relentless crawl of red numbers reflected off the floor-to-ceiling glass, painting the twilight skyline of San Francisco in the color of his evaporating empire. In the 48 hours since Audrey had walked out of Benjamin Croft's conference room, Pierce Dynamics had lost 22% of its market capitalization. Nathaniel stood frozen by the window, his bespoke Tom Ford suit jacket discarded on the leather sofa, his silk tie pulled loose. The silence in his executive suite was oppressive, broken only by the frantic tapping of keyboards from the war room down the hall. "It's not just the microchip acquisition, Nathaniel," David, the chief operating officer, said from the doorway. His voice was hollow, stripped of its usual corporate bravado. He stepped into the room, holding a thick, hastily printed dossier. "I've had our forensic accounting team working alongside risk management for the past 2 days. We're being systematically dismantled." Nathaniel turned, his eyes bloodshot. "Explain it to me, David. How does a shipping and real estate conglomerate trigger a catastrophic failure in an artificial intelligence firm? We write code. We build logistics software. Because software requires hardware to run, and hardware requires the earth," David replied grimly, dropping the dossier onto the marble desk. "The Sinclair Consortium isn't just shipping. They own the ships, yes, but they also own the deep water ports in Rotterdam, Long Beach, and Shanghai. They hold the controlling stake in the logistics network that transports the servers we buy." David flipped the folder open, pointing to a labyrinthine corporate flowchart. "It gets worse. The servers we rely on are built using highly specialized semiconductor nodes. The primary fabricator in Taiwan, TSMC, just informed us they are deprioritizing our silicon wafers due to unforeseen supply chain constraints regarding raw materials. Do you know who owns the mining rights to the neodymium and high-grade cobalt required for those specific wafers?" Nathaniel felt a cold dread pooling in his stomach. He didn't answer. He didn't have to. "A subsidiary of Sinclair Global Mining," David finished, tapping the page. "They aren't breaching any contracts, Nathaniel. They are just utilizing legal escape clauses, paying the penalty fees, and walking away. They are isolating us. Without the new Aegis microchips, and without the server hardware to expand our cloud infrastructure, our Q4 projections are pure fiction. Wall Street knows it. Goldman Sachs just downgraded our stock from strong buy to sell." "Valerie!" Nathaniel roared, the panic finally breaking through his paralysis. "Where the hell is Valerie? She's the CFO. She's supposed to be managing the institutional investors." The door opened wider, and Valerie Kensington stepped in, the statuesque, confident woman who had smirked over her espresso 3 days ago was gone. Her designer dress looked rumpled, her makeup was fading, and she was clutching 2 sleek mobile phones that hadn't stopped buzzing since Friday. "I'm trying, Nathaniel," Valerie said, her voice shrill with defensive anxiety. "I've been on the phone with BlackRock and Vanguard all morning. They won't take my calls. Their junior analysts are telling me they're rebalancing their portfolios. We're hemorrhaging institutional support." "Then fix it." Nathaniel slammed his hand on the marble desk, the sound echoing like a gunshot. "Issue a press release. Announce a stock buyback. Do your job, Valerie." "With what capital?" Valerie snapped back, dropping the facade of the supportive confidant. "Our liquid reserves were tied up in the Aegis acquisition, which failed, and now our credit rating is under review by Moody's. If we initiate a buyback now, we'll burn through our remaining cash runway in 6 months." Nathaniel sank into his ergonomic chair, burying his face in his hands. 10 years of ruthless climbing, of cultivating the perfect image, of discarding anyone who didn't fit his vision of relentless velocity. All of it was unraveling with terrifying precision. He thought of Audrey. He remembered the quiet, steady way she had signed the papers. He had thought she was surrendering. He hadn't realized she was simply dropping the leash. 6,000 miles away, in the penthouse study of a hyper-secure private tower, Overlooking Lake Geneva, Switzerland, Audrey Sinclair sat in a high-backed leather wing chair. The room smelled of old paper, polished mahogany, and the faint, crisp scent of the Alps. She wore a sharply tailored charcoal blazer over a cashmere turtleneck, a stark contrast to the unbranded, unassuming gowns she had worn in California. She looked exactly like what she was, the heir apparent to a $4 trillion dynasty. Sitting across from her was Alistair Sinclair. He was a man carved from granite, with piercing grey eyes that missed nothing, and a presence that could silence a boardroom with a mere sigh. He was swirling a glass of Macallan, 1926, watching his daughter with a mixture of immense pride and simmering anger. 10 years, Audrey, Alistair said softly, his voice a low rumble. You allowed that arrogant, short-sighted boy to diminish you for 10 years. You lived in his shadow, while he built his little sandcastle with the very bucket and spade you secretly bought him. Audrey took a slow sip of her Earl Grey tea. I loved him, Father. Or at least, I loved the man he was when he had nothing. I wanted to believe that success wouldn't rot his character. I was wrong, and I take full responsibility for my error in judgment. Love is a terribly expensive emotion, Alistair noted, setting his glass down. It clouds risk assessment. I warned you when you authorized that anonymous $500,000 angel investment through the Shell Company. I told you that men like Nathaniel Pierce do not value what they do not bleed for. You were right, Audrey conceded easily, which is why I am correcting the error. Alistair's eyes gleamed with a predatory satisfaction. The Aegis acquisition block was a masterful stroke, my dear. I must admit, watching his stock price crater over breakfast has been tremendously entertaining. Jonathan Graves informed me the divorce is sealed. No alimony, no settlement. You left him his $10 million. I didn't want his money, Audrey said, her tone devoid of malice, replaced entirely by cold, calculated business acumen. I want his monopoly. Pierce Dynamics relies on the illusion of inevitability. Nathaniel convinced the tech sector that his AI logistics platform was the only viable future. I intend to prove him wrong. She reached into her leather portfolio and withdrew a thick, bound proposal, sliding it across the antique desk toward her father. I have spent the last decade quietly observing the tech landscape from inside the belly of the beast, Audrey explained. Pierce Dynamics' core algorithm is bloated. Nathaniel focuses on flashy front-end interfaces and press releases, but their back-end architecture hasn't been truly innovated in 4 years. They are vulnerable. Alistair opened the proposal, his eyes scanning the executive summary. Sinclair Nexus, a decentralized, quantum-resistant logistics AI. Exactly, Audrey said. We already possess the global infrastructure. We have the shipping lanes, the ports, the warehouses, and the raw materials. If we integrate Sinclair Nexus directly into our existing physical supply chains, we can offer a proprietary, end-to-end logistics solution that operates 30% faster and 40% cheaper than anything Pierce Dynamics can license. Alistair looked up, a rare, genuine smile touching the corners of his mouth. You don't just want to cripple his company. You want to render it entirely obsolete. Nathaniel told me I was a liability, Audrey said, her gaze steady and cold. He told me I didn't understand the velocity of the life he built. I am simply going to show him what true velocity looks like when the Sinclair Consortium decides to accelerate. Consider the Nexus initiative fully funded, Alistair said, closing the folder. Welcome back to the table, Audrey. It's time the world remembered who truly runs it. 3 weeks later, the atmosphere inside the grand ballroom of the Pierre Hotel in Manhattan was electric with the scent of old money and new panic. It was the annual Global Tech Innovators Summit Gala, an invitation-only event where multi-billion-dollar mergers were whispered over caviar and champagne. For Nathaniel Pierce, it was supposed to be a victory lap. He had RSVP'd a month ago, fully intending to arrive as the undisputed king of Silicon Valley, having just swallowed Aegis Micrologistics. Instead, he arrived as a bleeding target. Pierce Dynamics stock had stabilized, but only after shedding a catastrophic 35% of its value. The financial press was circling like vultures, publishing relentless op-eds about Nathaniel's sudden lack of vision and the mysterious supply chain plagues haunting his company. He desperately needed a lifeline. He needed a cash injection from one of the major private equity titans in the room to restore market confidence. Nathaniel adjusted his bow tie nervously, his jaw clenched tight. Beside him, Valerie Kensington was rigidly holding a glass of Dom Perignon. The stress of the past 3 weeks had aged her. The confident, predatory CFO was gone, replaced by a woman desperately trying to pretend the ship wasn't sinking beneath her Christian Louboutin heels. Andreessen Horowitz's table is over by the ice sculpture, Valerie whispered, her eyes darting around the room. I spoke with one of their managing partners this afternoon. If we can get 10 minutes with them privately, we might be able to pitch a structured convertible debt deal. Debt, Nathaniel hissed, the word tasting like ash in his mouth. We're Pierce Dynamics. We don't beg for debt. We do now, Nathaniel, Valerie snapped, her patience finally fraying. Unless you have magically manifested a new semiconductor supply chain in your tuxedo pocket. Before Nathaniel could reprimand her, a sudden, palpable shift occurred in the ballroom. The low roar of hundreds of overlapping conversations began to die down, dropping into a hushed collective murmur that rippled toward the grand entrance. Heads turned. Even the string quartet seemed to lower their volume. Nathaniel frowned, turning to follow the gaze of the crowd. Standing at the top of the grand marble staircase, flanked by 2 imposing security personnel, was a woman who seemed to command the very air in the room. She was draped in a breathtaking, custom Schiaparelli haute couture gown, a masterpiece of deep emerald silk and structural gold accents that looked more like armor than fabric. Around her neck rested a necklace of flawless, unheated Burmese rubies that belonged in a museum, not on a red carpet. It took Nathaniel 3 full seconds to recognize her. Audrey, he breathed, the name catching in his throat. It was impossible. The woman he had discarded was meek, unassuming, content to hide in the shadows of his brilliance. The woman descending the stairs moved with the terrifying, predatory grace of an apex predator, stepping into a territory she already owned. "Who is she with?" Valerie whispered, her voice trembling. "Nathaniel. Look at who is escorting her." Nathaniel's eyes shifted from Audrey to the men surrounding her as she reached the ballroom floor. She wasn't just attending the gala, she was holding court. To her left was the CEO of Vanguard. To her right, laughing warmly at something she had just said, was the head of Apollo Global Management, the very man Nathaniel was hoping to beg for money later that evening. "What is she doing here?" Nathaniel muttered, his mind failing to process the visual data. "How did she even get a ticket?" He didn't wait for Valerie's answer. Propelled by a toxic mixture of confusion, lingering arrogance, and rising panic, Nathaniel shoved his way through the crowd of elite billionaires, ignoring their annoyed glances. He had to confront her. He had to understand what game she was playing. He intercepted her near the center of the room, blocking her path, just as the CEO of Vanguard stepped away to greet a colleague. "Audrey," Nathaniel said, his voice tight. Audrey stopped. She didn't flinch. She didn't look surprised. She looked at him with the polite, distant curiosity one might reserve for a stranger asking for directions. "Nathaniel?" she replied smoothly. Her voice was different. The soft, accommodating tone was gone, replaced by a resonant, icy authority. "I see you're still wearing Tom Ford. Predictable." Nathaniel bristled. "What are you doing here? This is an exclusive summit for industry leaders. You can't just buy your way in with the severance money He stopped himself, remembering she hadn't taken his money. "How did you get in here?" Audrey tilted her head slightly, a razor-thin smile touching her lips. "I didn't buy my way in, Nathaniel. I sponsor the event. Or rather, my family's foundation does." Nathaniel stared at her, the pieces of the nightmare from the past 3 weeks suddenly colliding in his mind. Audrey Sinclair, the Sinclair Consortium, the hostile takeover, the severed supply lines. "It was you," he whispered, the realization hitting him with the force of a physical blow. The color drained from his face entirely. The Aegis buyout, the TSMC delays, the Asian suppliers, that was you. "A simple restructuring of corporate priorities," Audrey said lightly, taking a sip from a crystal flute of water. "I merely advised my father's board that Pierce Dynamics was no longer a reliable partner. They acted accordingly." "Your father," Nathaniel choked out. "Alistair Sinclair, you're his daughter?" "I am," Audrey said. "The anchor to your sale. I believe the press called me. I simply decided to stop holding you in place. You wanted to fly, Nathaniel. I am letting you." "You lied to me for 10 years, Nathaniel hissed, his anger flaring, desperate to regain some semblance of control. "You manipulated me. You hid billions of dollars while I broke my back building a company from the ground up." Audrey's eyes turned entirely glacial. The polite smile vanished. She stepped half an inch closer to him, and despite being shorter, she suddenly seemed to tower over him. "Do not dare speak to me of manipulation, Nathaniel," she said, her voice dropping to a lethal whisper that only he could hear. "I hid my name so you could build your own. I quietly funded your Series A when every venture capitalist on Sand Hill Road laughed you out of their offices. I stood by you while you morphed from a brilliant, passionate innovator into a shallow, narcissistic shell of a man. I tolerated your insults, your blatant affairs, and your insufferable ego, because I believed in the vows we took." She paused, letting the words sink into his skin like venom. "You demanded the divorce. You sat in your glass tower with your mediocre mistress smirking on your sofa, and you told me I was a liability. You offered me a $10 million tip to disappear. I am simply obliging you. I have disappeared from your life, and consequently, my family's infrastructure has disappeared from your supply chain." Nathaniel was hyperventilating now. The crushing weight of his colossal mistake was suffocating him. He had thrown away the keys to a $4 trillion empire because he wanted a younger woman who looked good in designer clothes. "Audrey, please," Nathaniel said, his voice cracking. The Billionaire CEO was practically begging in the middle of the ballroom. "You've made your point. You've humbled me. But you're destroying my life's work. We can fix this. We can talk. We were married for a decade." "We were," Audrey interrupted, her voice returning to its normal, composed volume as a few wealthy guests began to look their way. "But as you pointed out in your office, Nathaniel, we want different things. You want to move at 100 miles a minute. And Audrey turned toward the center stage of the ballroom as the master of ceremonies tapped the microphone, calling for the room's attention. "I am about to move much faster than that," she finished. She turned her back on him and walked gracefully toward the stage, the crowd parting for her with deferential respect. Nathaniel stood frozen in place, watching in horror as the master of ceremonies smiled broadly. "Ladies and gentlemen, titans of the industry," the MC announced, his voice booming over the speakers. "It is my profound honor to introduce the new CEO of Sinclair Tech Ventures, who is here tonight to announce a revolutionary, fully integrated quantum logistics platform that will redefine global supply chains. Please welcome Ms. Audrey Sinclair." The ballroom erupted in thunderous applause. Nathaniel closed his eyes as the applause washed over him, drowning out the last remnants of his shattered ego. He didn't need to hear the rest of the speech. He knew exactly what it meant. Audrey wasn't just starving his company of resources. She was stepping onto the battlefield to obliterate him entirely. Valerie walked up beside him, her face pale as a sheet. "Nathaniel, what did she just say? Did he just say Sinclair Tech Ventures?" Nathaniel opened his eyes, looking at the woman on stage who used to pour him coffee in a cramped Palo Alto apartment. She looked radiant, powerful, and utterly untouchable. "Pack your desk, Valerie," Nathaniel said, his voice hollow and defeated. "It's over." 2 months after the Global Tech Innovators Summit, the sprawling corporate campus of Pierce Dynamics in Silicon Valley resembled a ghost town. The employee parking lots, once jammed with Teslas and Porsches, were largely empty. Inside the glass-walled corridors, the ping-pong tables gathered dust, and the free espresso bars had been shut down to conserve capital. Nathaniel Pierce sat alone in his cavernous office, the San Francisco fog pressing against the windows like a shroud. The Bloomberg terminal, which he used to watch with the eager anticipation of a gambler on a winning streak, now served as his daily executioner. Pierce Dynamics stock, which had traded at a robust $310 a share on the day of his divorce, was currently hovering at $4.15. He was drowning. When Audrey's Sinclair Tech Ventures launched their quantum logistics platform, it was a flawless execution of corporate warfare. It didn't just compete with Pierce Dynamics, it rendered their software utterly obsolete. FedEx, DHL, and Maersk, 3 of Nathaniel's biggest enterprise clients, had broken their contracts within the same week, willingly paying the termination fees to migrate to the faster, cheaper Sinclair Nexus system. The door to the executive suite clicked open. Nathaniel didn't look up from his desk, where a mountain of past due notices and legal injunctions lay scattered. "David, did you get Stephen Schwartzman on the line?" Nathaniel asked, his voice hoarse. He had been trying to reach the CEO of Blackstone all morning, begging for a distressed asset bailout. "David resigned this morning, Nathaniel." Nathaniel's head snapped up. It wasn't his chief operating officer standing in the doorway. It was Valerie Kensington. She wasn't wearing Oscar de la Renta today. She wore a subdued, off-the-rack navy pantsuit, and she was carrying a cardboard banker's box. "What are you doing, Valerie?" Nathaniel demanded, pushing himself up from his leather chair. The dark circles under his eyes made him look 10 years older. "We have an emergency board meeting in 20 minutes to discuss the Chapter 11 restructuring. I need my CFO." "You don't have a CFO, Nathaniel," Valerie said, her voice devoid of the flirtatious warmth she had weaponized just months prior. She set a crisp white envelope on the edge of a side table. "That's my formal resignation, effective immediately." Nathaniel stared at her, genuine shock piercing through his exhaustion. "You're leaving? Now? After you convinced me we could weather this?" Valerie offered a tight, unsympathetic smile. "I'm 30 years old, Nathaniel. I have a career to think about. KKR just offered me a lateral move as a senior risk analyst. It's a step down in title, but at least their checks won't bounce. I can't have a catastrophic bankruptcy on my resume." "You parasitic coward," Nathaniel spat, stepping out from behind his desk. You were happy to drink my champagne and wear the diamonds I bought you when we were on top. You pushed me to finalize the divorce so you could take her place. I pushed you to secure the company's future. Valerie shot back, her composure cracking to reveal a sharp, self-serving edge. It's not my fault your wife turned out to be the heir to a $4 trillion syndicate. You were the one who treated her like garbage, Nathaniel. You lit the match. I'm just walking away from the fire. She picked up her box, giving the empty, silent office one last look. Good luck in bankruptcy court. You're going to need it. As the heavy glass door clicked shut behind her, Nathaniel collapsed back into his chair. He was entirely alone. The sycophants, the Hollywood A-listers, the opportunistic executives, they had all vanished the moment the Sinclair shadow fell over him. He picked up his Montblanc pen, the same one he had used to sign his marriage away, and hurled it against the wall. It shattered, splattering dark ink across his framed Forbes magazine cover. The federal bankruptcy court in the Northern District of California smelled of floor wax and institutional despair. Nathaniel sat at the petitioner's table, flanked by Benjamin Croft, his high-priced lawyer whose retainer was rapidly depleting Nathaniel's last remaining liquid funds. They were there to finalize a desperate Chapter 11 reorganization. Nathaniel had personally guaranteed a massive bridge loan to cover the disastrous Aegis microchip fallout, to protect his Atherton estate and his private jet from being seized by creditors. He had to prove Pierce Dynamics still retained its core intellectual property to secure a debt restructuring plan. Your Honor, Benjamin Croft addressed the judge, adjusting his glasses. While my client's firm has suffered severe market contraction, Pierce Dynamics still wholly owns the proprietary AI source code, the crown jewel of the company. We plan to license this heavily to mid-market logistics firms, which will generate sufficient capital to satisfy the Class A creditors over a 5-year period. The judge nodded, looking over the filings. If the IP is secure, Mr. Croft, I am inclined to approve the restructuring. Objection, Your Honor. The refined, aristocratic voice echoed from the back of the courtroom. Nathaniel's blood ran cold. He turned around, walking down the center aisle, looking as terrifyingly composed as he had in the law office months ago. Was Jonathan Graves. The British attorney carried the same slender leather folder. Mr. Graves? The judge asked, looking over his spectacles. You represent a creditor in this matter? I represent Apex Capital Holdings, Your Honor, Graves said smoothly, stepping through the swinging wooden gate and approaching the bench. He handed a thick stack of legal documents to the bailiff. And I'm afraid Mr. Croft is operating under a catastrophic misunderstanding regarding the ownership of Pierce Dynamics' intellectual property. Nathaniel leaned over to Croft, his heart hammering against his ribs. Apex Capital? That's the angel investment firm that saved us in year 2. What do they have to do with this? Croft looked panicked, frantically flipping through his own files. 10 years ago, Graves continued, addressing the court, Apex Capital provided a vital $500,000 cash injection to Pierce Dynamics. However, it was not a traditional equity purchase. It was structured as a convertible security, tied directly to the funding of the core algorithmic patents. Graves turned to look directly at Nathaniel. His eyes were flat and merciless. Under the terms of that original contract, which Mr. Pierce signed, Apex Capital retained the foundational patents and granted Pierce Dynamics an exclusive, royalty-free license to use them. However, Graves paused, letting the silence hang in the courtroom like a guillotine. Section 4, paragraph B of that contract contains a dissolution trigger. If Pierce Dynamics ever filed for bankruptcy protection, or if the founder's gross negligence severely damaged the brand, the license would be immediately and permanently revoked, and full ownership of the developed software would revert entirely to Apex Capital. Croft shot to his feet, his face red. "That's absurd. We developed that code. A minor seed investor cannot seize a multi-billion-dollar IP over a standard restructuring." "They can when the contract explicitly allows it," Graves countered mildly. "Furthermore, Apex Capital Holdings is a wholly owned subsidiary of the Sinclair Consortium. My client, Ms. Audrey Sinclair, is the sole managing director. She has chosen to execute the dissolution trigger. The license is revoked. Pierce Dynamics owns absolutely nothing. Not the code, not the patents, not the servers. It is a hollow shell." The courtroom spun. The air left Nathaniel's lungs in a violent rush. The $500,000 angel investment. The money that saved him when he was a nobody. The money he had used to build his empire. It wasn't just a lifeline. It was a leash. Audrey hadn't just funded him. She had legally owned the foundation of his company from the very first day. She let him build the house, knowing she held the deed to the land beneath it. "Mr. Croft," the judge said, his tone turning severe, "is this accurate? Does your client not own the patents?" Croft was pale, staring at the contract Graves had provided. "Your Honor, I was unaware of this original seed structure. It predates my tenure as corporate counsel." "Then the reorganization plan is denied." The judge struck his gavel with a sharp, final crack. "Without underlying assets, Pierce Dynamics is insolvent. I am ordering immediate Chapter 7 liquidation. The creditors may begin seizing assets." The gavel strike echoed in Nathaniel's mind long after the judge left the bench. He sat paralyzed at the table. He didn't just lose his company. Because of his personal guarantees on the corporate loans, the creditors would take everything: his Atherton mansion, his cars, his remaining bank accounts. He had offered Audrey Sinclair $10 million to disappear. Now, she had taken the entire $8 billion empire, and he was the one walking away with less than nothing. Graves approached the table, buttoning his bespoke suit jacket. He looked down at the ruined billionaire. "Miss Sinclair asked me to deliver a final message, Mr. Pierce," Graves said quietly. Nathaniel slowly looked up, his eyes hollow, stripped of all arrogance. "What?" "She said to tell you," Graves murmured, his voice as cold as a winter tide, "that she hopes you enjoy the velocity of your descent." Graves turned and walked out of the courtroom, leaving Nathaniel alone in the wreckage of his own hubris. The tragedy of Nathaniel Pierce was not that he lost an empire, but that he never truly built one. Blinded by the intoxicating glare of his own ego, he mistook his wife's quiet loyalty for weakness and her silent support for irrelevance. When he severed their marriage to chase a shallow, glamorous illusion, he inadvertently cut the very tether that kept him from crashing into the earth. Audrey Sinclair did not destroy him out of petty vengeance. She simply removed the invisible, trillion-dollar foundation she had placed beneath his feet, allowing gravity to do the rest. The story of the anchor and the sail ended exactly as the tabloids had predicted, but with a brutal twist of irony. Nathaniel finally learned that a sail without an anchor does not conquer the ocean. It simply tears itself apart in the wind.